In this lecture, we're going to investigate the causes of why some lineages diversify, so radiate into so many new species, and some of the mechanisms by which that can actually happen. The first thing that we will talk about is passive divergence, and we will cover this in the speciation lecture. This is effectively allopatric speciation. This is geographic barriers inducing some type of reproductive isolation. Up on the screen here we have our islands in the Galapagos, where on each of these different islands there's a different species of ground finch, and this is one of the reasons why Darwin, who was so enthralled with the Galapagos, found so much to write about on his visit here. Okay, so geographic barriers. It creates segregated populations, effectively forced reproductive isolation. We can have other types of geographic barriers. We can have entire mountain ranges. The Rocky Mountains would be one example, Blue Mountains here in Australia. The Grand Canyon, we have two different squirrels on either side of the Grand Canyon that originally were one species and subsequently diverged through passive divergence, the progressive accumulation of genetic changes through stochastic means, for example, random mutation over time. And over time, sometimes long periods of time, these populations have diverged enough that they are now different species. Ecological opportunity is another mechanism that can really ramp up the speciation process and really increase lineage diversification. We have a wonderful example here, which is basically an experiment done in a test tube. These researchers put E. coli into a test tube that originally had two types of fluid in it, an oily substance that would sit on the top of a more fluid substance in the bottom. And in one treatment, they vigorously shook that up to homogenize that environment, and the other, they just left it as a heterogeneous environment, and they just followed it over time. And over a certain amount of time, they found in the heterogeneous environment, this single morphotype had actually diversified into three different morphotypes. The first morphotype was a morphology that sat on top of the surface of the fluid, so it had become adapted to that particular type of niche. The second was effectively the original ancestral morphology, which floated around in the fluid medium. And then the third type was one that actually stuck to the bottom of the test tube, and it was adapted to that particular microhabitat. In the homogeneous treatments, of course, there was no heterogeneity in the environment, and the morphotype was effectively retained its ancestral morphology. So ecological opportunity, invading new environments, having lots of new niches open up can really accelerate that diversification process. Key innovations is another way that can also accelerate diversification. It opens up ecological opportunity. Now, key innovations, I'll go through a couple of examples in just a moment, but to define it, it's a trait that allows members of a lineage to interact with the environment in a novel way. Perhaps it's a new environment, it allows them to invade new environments, or it allows them to engage in their existing environment in a novel way and opens up ecological niches. So for example, pollination in plants, there are two forms. There's wind pollination, which is the ancestral type, and animal pollination through things like insects, so bees, but also birds. Those species that use animal pollinators have dramatically increased their diversification as a consequence of that key innovation. Another key innovation is toepads in geckos. If you've ever wondered why geckos seem to be able to hang from the ceiling with no trouble at all, it's because they've evolved this unique toe morphology, these toe pads that allow them to effectively climb over any surface. What this has done, it's opened up that environment into a full three-dimensional environment. So lots of different types of ecological niches, lineages adapting to those different niches, and subsequently formation of lots of new species as a consequence. But it's not just about opening up new opportunities, it's also about escaping from previous constraints. In the case of plants, escaping from enemies, so herbivores in particular. So plants evolving things like spines to deter herbivores, but also chemical compounds within their vegetation that again are designed to deter herbivores. For example, chili and coffee. These are all actually chemical defenses that have been employed, evolved in plants for the purposes of reducing herbivory. We're just very strange and we love to have caffeine and we love to have chili as a consequence. Character displacement is another mechanism by which populations can diverge. We'll return to the Galapagos Islands. On one small island, we have the medium ground finch on Daphne major. And on the neighbouring island, about 10 kilometres away, much larger, Santa Cruz, it is also existing. In addition to that, we have a small ground finch. Again, occurs on one of these smaller offshore islands, but also co-occurs with the medium ground finch on Santa Cruz. Now, where they co-occur on Santa Cruz, they're in competition. They're in competition for food resources. When they're by themselves, they have roughly similar beak sizes, and beak size in these finches correlates to the type of seeds that these animals feed on. So when they come in to sympatry on Santa Cruz, they become in competition with each other, and as a consequence of that, they've progressively diverged in their resource use. They've become specialized on different types of seeds. This has translated to an adaptation in terms of the beak morphology and led to this character displacement, this evolutionary divergence in the morphology. And if that happens enough and for long enough, that those populations that are now on Santa Cruz could diverge to the point that if they returned home to their allopatric islands, they would no longer be recognized as an individual species, or as the same species, I should say. So character displacement, another mechanism for enforcing reproductive isolation through ecological adaptation. So why do species diversify? Geographic barriers, passive divergence, the progressive accumulation of genetic mutations and other changes in morphology through random mutation either side of a mountain range on two different islands. Given enough times, those populations can actually diverge enough that they form new species. But to really accelerate the speciation process really increase adaptive divergence, we have the invasion of new environments, opening up all sorts of new ecological opportunities. This can be facilitated through the evolution of key innovations, methods to exploit that new environment in novel ways or escape enemies. And last of which, we have resource competition, so character displacement, driving a wedge between populations that can ultimately diverge enough to form new species.